Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Imagine a place where the mountains touch the sky, where the morning mist curls between ancient pine trees, and where the silence carries secrets that time has refused to bury. We are in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, a region where wilderness still dictated the rhythm of life, and where every shadow seemed to hold its own mystery. Comment on where you are watching this somber account from. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The year was 1912. The world was heading towards profound transformations. But there in the mountains of Tennessee, time seemed to flow differently. The communities lived in isolation, connected only by narrow trails that snaked between rocks and deep valleys. Life was hard, shaped by the unpredictable climate and the inhospitable vastness of those lands. That autumn, as the leaves began to take on shades of bronze and crimson, something happened that would forever change how the inhabitants of that region viewed their own mountains. Mary Lou Carter was known to everyone in Sevier County. A woman of striking personality, she lived on a secluded property on the highest slopes, where civilization seemed a distant concept. Her house, a wooden structure resistant to harsh winters, stood at the end of a dirt road that few dared to travel. Mary Lou had chosen that place precisely for its isolation, for the peace that the heights offered. But peace, they would later discover, can be a dangerous illusion. For weeks, no one heard from her. The closest neighbors, who lived miles away, were puzzled by the absence of smoke coming from her chimney. Mary Lou always kept the fire burning, even on the hottest days, preparing preserves and smoking meats for the approaching winter. The silence emanating from that property was unnatural, unsettling. When someone finally decided to go up there to check, what they found was the beginning of an enigma that would span generations. The front door was ajar, swaying gently in the wind that swept down from the mountains. Inside the house, everything seemed to have been left in haste. The table still bore the remains of a meal, utensils scattered, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of an everyday task. Clothes were strewn across the floor, drawers open, papers strewn about, but there were no obvious signs of violence. There was no blood on the walls, no furniture broken in a struggle. It was as if Mary Lou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only fragments of a life that continued without her. The locals began to scour the surrounding area. There were many trails, each leading to different places in the mountains. Some paths ended at steep cliffs, others disappeared into woods so dense that sunlight barely penetrated. They found footprints, but they were confusing, going in opposite directions, some appearing to have been made by more than one person. There were drag marks near the property, furrows in the earth suggesting that something heavy had been moved. But where to? And why? County newspapers began publishing vague reports about the disappearance. Local authorities, limited in resources and experience, attempted to mount an investigation, but the vastness of the territory made any search a nearly impossible task. The mountains held secrets well, and Mary Lou Carter had become another one. The case attracted the attention of people from distant villages, all wanting to understand what had happened to this woman who had chosen to live in the heights. The following weeks brought more questions than answers. County investigators scoured every inch of Mary Lou's property, cataloguing objects, searching for clues that might shed light on the mystery. What they discovered was a collection of perplexing details that didn't seem to form a coherent picture. There was a diary kept in a dresser drawer, its yellowed pages covered in elegant, firm handwriting. The last entries dated back a few weeks before the disappearance, but the content was disturbingly vague. Mary Lou wrote about strange sensations, about the feeling of being watched during her walks along the trails. She mentioned shadows moving among the trees at dusk, sounds she couldn't identify echoing through the valley at night. Some locals suggested she might be suffering from loneliness. That isolation in the mountains sometimes played tricks on people's minds. But there was something in the way she described these experiences that conveyed genuine concern, not unfounded paranoia. In the barn next to the house, they found tools arranged in an unusual way. Axes, saws, and other agricultural implements were organized in patterns that made no sense to anyone familiar with Mary Lou's habits. It was as if someone had searched the place looking for something specific. The animal feed had been left open, scattered across the dirt floor. The animals themselves, 2 mules and some chickens, seemed agitated, refusing to approach certain areas of the property. A neighbor reported seeing unusual smoke rising from the property 3 nights before Mary Lou was reported missing. It wasn't the familiar smoke from the chimney, but something denser, darker, coming from behind the house near the tree line. When asked why he hadn't investigated at the time, the man admitted that something in the air that night had made him feel it would be better to stay on his own land. It was a difficult feeling to explain, he said, like an invisible weight pressing against his chest, a silent warning not to approach. County office records showed that Mary Lou had sold part of her land months earlier, a transaction that drew attention because it was done quickly and for a lower price than expected. The buyer was a man from eastern Tennessee, someone no one in the region knew well. He had appeared in the nearest village, made the purchase through a local lawyer, and disappeared soon after. Attempts to locate him for questioning were unsuccessful. The address he left on the documents led to an abandoned property in another county. Theories began to multiply like weeds. Some believed that Mary Lou had simply decided to leave, to start a new life somewhere far away, perhaps tired of the harshness of that solitary existence. Others whispered about land disputes, about people who coveted those properties in the mountains, and who would not hesitate to use shady methods to obtain them. There were those who spoke of dangerous travelers who crossed the mountains, rootless men who lived on the fringes of the law and left a trail of mysteries wherever they went. A particularly intriguing detail emerged when they examined the area around the house more carefully. Near the well that supplied water to the property, they found recent signs of digging. The earth had been removed and then replaced, but whoever had done it hadn't bothered to completely disguise the work. When they dug at that spot, hoping to find something revealing, they discovered only stones and more earth. Whatever someone had buried there was no longer there, or perhaps it never had been. The winter of 1912 arrived early that year, bringing with it blizzards that further isolated the mountain communities. The search for Mary Lou was temporarily suspended, the trails becoming impassable under thick layers of snow and ice. During those dark months, the case remained alive only in conversations around the fireside, in speculations that grew with each repetition. When spring finally melted the snow, it revealed something no one expected to find. A hunter traversing the higher slopes following deer tracks came across a cabin that few knew existed. It was an old structure, probably used by hunters of past generations, hidden in a narrow valley surrounded by rock formations. The door was locked from the outside, a detail that immediately seemed strange. Who would lock an abandoned cabin like that? And more importantly, what could be kept inside that would require such a precaution? When the authorities managed to force their way in, they found a space that had clearly been recently occupied. There were remnants of provisions, blankets piled in a corner, candles burned to the ground, but most disconcerting were the papers scattered on the floor. Detailed maps of the region, with specific markings circling various isolated properties, including that of Mary Lou Carter. There were also notes in handwriting that no one recognized, numbers that seemed to represent values, dates that corresponded to land transactions in recent years. The discovery completely transformed the nature of the investigation. It was no longer an isolated disappearance, but possibly something far more complex and calculated. Investigators began reviewing old records, looking for patterns that might have gone unnoticed. What they found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, other properties in the region had changed hands under questionable circumstances. Owners who sold their land hastily and then disappeared, leaving behind entire lives without apparent explanation. A name began to appear repeatedly in the documents. William Thorne, described as an itinerant land agent, had been involved in several of these transactions. According to the records, he traveled through the mountain counties, offering brokerage services for the purchase and sale of properties. But when they tried to track him down, they discovered that William Thorne seemed to be a ghost. There were no records of him in any official office before 1908, no personal history, no known family. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere specifically to conduct these shady dealings. Interviews with people who had interacted with Thorne revealed a consistent pattern. He was described as a middle-aged man, well-dressed by local standards, with polite manners that contrasted with the rusticity of the mountain dwellers. He spoke confidently about opportunities, about buyers interested in remote land for future development. He convinced people that they were getting a good deal, that they would have a chance to start over in less isolated places. And then, after the contracts were signed, both Thorne and the sellers simply disappeared. Mary Lou's property proved to be even more valuable than initially thought. There were rumors of mineral deposits in that mountain region, whispers that companies from the north were interested in exploring resources that remained hidden beneath those ancient lands. Could that be the reason? Had Mary Lou discovered something she shouldn't have? The questions multiplied, each partial answer generating 10 new ones. A forgotten detail resurfaced when a merchant from the nearest village remembered seeing Mary Lou a few weeks before her disappearance. She had bought unusual supplies, things that weren't part of her usual purchases. Gunpowder, for example, even though she didn't own firearms. She had also acquired heavy chains and padlocks, strange items for someone living alone. When asked if she seemed worried or frightened, the merchant hesitated before replying that yes, there was something different about her that day. Something in her eyes suggested fear, but also determination. The investigation took an unexpected turn when old documents were discovered in the Blount County archives neighboring Sevier. Among dusty papers and nearly forgotten records, an employee found references to land disputes dating back decades. Entire families had clashed over property boundaries in that mountainous region, where maps were inaccurate and oral tradition often prevailed over official documentation. Mary Lou Carter, it turned out, was at the center of one of these old disputes. Their property had been inherited through a complicated lineage, with competing claims that were never fully resolved. There was one family in particular, the Brennans, who claimed rights to part of that land based on a verbal agreement made generations ago. Although the courts had favored Mary Lou in previous disputes, the Brennans never fully accepted the decision. They still lived nearby, on a smaller property on the lower slopes, and resentment ran deep like the roots of ancient trees. Witnesses began to come forward with accounts they had kept to themselves out of fear or uncertainty. A woman who regularly traveled the road near Mary Lou's property mentioned seeing a group of men riding toward that area on the night the strange smoke was sighted. She couldn't identify who they were because of the darkness, but the number of horses and the speed at which they were moving suggested urgency, perhaps something planned. When pressed about why she hadn't reported it sooner, she admitted fearing reprisals, as she recognized one of the horses as belonging to someone influential in the region. Investigators visited the Brennan family, finding an atmosphere of palpable tension. The patriarch, an elderly but still robust man, denied any involvement in Mary Lou's disappearance. He stated that, despite differences over land, he had never wished his wife harm. His sons, 3 adult men who worked the land alongside their father, remained silent for most of the interrogation, their faces impenetrable. But one of them, the youngest, seemed uneasy, his eyes darting away whenever Mary Lou's name was mentioned. Weeks after that visit, the youngest son of the Brennans also disappeared. He left his home before dawn, taking only what was necessary, and was never seen in the area again. His sudden departure immediately raised suspicions. Had he been involved in something that now weighed too heavily on his conscience? Or had he simply decided to escape the suffocating atmosphere of accusations and suspicious glances that now surrounded his family? His absence only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to a case that already seemed impossible to solve. Meanwhile, Mary Lou's property remained abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Vegetation began to invade the space around the house, vines twining around the wooden walls, moss covering the roof. Local residents avoided the place, developing superstitions about those lands. They said that at night they could hear sounds coming from the property, even though no one lived there anymore. Footsteps on the porch, creaking doors, sometimes even distant voices carried by the mountain wind. Rational or not, fear had settled in that piece of land. A surprising development occurred in the summer of 1913. A lawyer from Knoxville appeared in the county with documents claiming to represent the interests of Mary Lou Carter. According to him, his client had contacted him by mail, requesting his services to resolve outstanding issues related to her property. The lawyer stated that Mary Lou was alive, residing temporarily out of state, and wished to sell her land through a power of attorney. The news caused an immediate commotion. The authorities demanded proof of the correspondence's authenticity. The lawyer presented letters bearing Mary Lou's signature, documents that appeared legitimate at first glance. Experts were called in to examine the handwriting, comparing it to known samples from the diary found on the property. The results were inconclusive. Some aspects of the writing matched, while others showed subtle differences that could be explained by various factors, ranging from natural changes in writing style to the physical or emotional state of the person writing. Knoxville's lawyer, identified as Samuel Hartwick, quickly became the center of attention in Sevier County. His presence there generated mixed reactions among the residents. Some saw in him a possible connection to Mary Lou, a hope that she was truly alive and well somewhere far away. Others saw his appearance as another piece in a sinister puzzle, questioning his true intentions and the legitimacy of his documents. Hartwick was a meticulous man, always dressed in formal attire that made him stand out in the rustic mountain surroundings, carrying a worn leather briefcase full of papers that he constantly examined. During questioning by authorities, Hartwick maintained an impeccable professional demeanor. He explained that he had been contacted through a mailroom in Nashville, where Mary Lou had supposedly left her letters. According to his account, she had expressed a desire to permanently leave the Tennessee mountains, seeking a fresh start somewhere where the weight of old disputes wouldn't haunt her. The letters mentioned weariness, a deep need for peace that those lands could no longer offer. Hartwick presented all this with conviction, but when pressed about his client's exact whereabouts, he became evasive, citing professional confidentiality and her right to privacy. The investigators were not satisfied with these vague explanations. They sent telegrams to Nashville, requesting verification of Hartwick's story from the mail offices mentioned. The response took weeks to arrive, due to the communication difficulties of the time and the distance between the mountain counties and the state capital. When they finally received a reply, the information was disturbingly ambiguous. Yes, there was a record of a woman using the name Mary Lou Carter, who had used the mail services during that period. No, there was no way to confirm if it was really her, as the employees could not guarantee the identity of all the clients who used their facilities. While these investigations were taking place, Hartwick remained in the county, staying at a modest boarding house in the nearest village. His prolonged presence intrigued the locals. Why would a lawyer from a town like Knoxville dedicate so much time to a case in such a remote region? The fees he could charge Mary Lou certainly wouldn't justify such dedication, especially considering she had sold land below market value months before. There was something else motivating Samuel Hartwick, something he didn't reveal in formal conversations with authorities or casual encounters with locals. A journalist from a small regional newspaper decided to investigate Hartwick's past more thoroughly. What he discovered was a professional trajectory marked by controversial cases involving property disputes in various parts of Tennessee. Hartwick had a reputation for working on complex situations, representing clients who were frequently involved in land deals with questionable circumstances. There was nothing explicitly illegal in his record, but a pattern was beginning to emerge, a specialization in cases where documentation was dubious and witnesses were scarce or unreliable. The connection between Hartwick and William Thorne, the mysterious land agent who had disappeared, became the subject of intense speculation. Although there was no direct evidence linking the two, their operations seemed unsettlingly complementary. Thorne convinced landowners to sell. Hartwick perhaps provided the legal framework necessary to legitimize problematic transactions. It was a theory, nothing more than that, but it made sense to many who followed the case with growing frustration at the lack of concrete answers. During a rainy August night, something happened that would once again change the course of the investigation. A fire broke out on Mary Lou Carter's abandoned property. The flames were spotted by distant residents who saw the orange glow cutting through the darkness of the mountains. By the time they reached the scene, it was too late to save the structure. The wooden house burned completely, reduced to ashes and charred rubble. The barn and other smaller buildings were also consumed by the flames. The heavy rain that fell that night eventually extinguished the fire, but the damage was done. The origin of the fire was never determined with certainty. Some suggested it might have been lightning, as the storm was severe and the tall wooden structures were natural targets. Others believed it was intentional, an attempt to destroy evidence that might have been hidden in those buildings for so long. The timing was too suspicious to be mere coincidence, occurring just as the investigation gained new momentum with Hartwick's presence and renewed public interest in the case. If there was anything important hidden on that property, it was now irretrievably lost in the ashes. Samuel Hartwick left the county shortly after the fire. He claimed to have received new instructions from Mary Lou via correspondence, informing him that she had decided to completely abandon the idea of selling the land and that she no longer wished for any legal intervention in her affairs. He formally bid farewell to the authorities, left his contact cards should they need him in the future, and departed on the stagecoach that ran between the counties. His departure left a void of information, but also a palpable relief among many residents who had felt uncomfortable with his prolonged presence. Official county records showed that Mary Lou's property remained in her name in the following years, the fees being paid anonymously through a bank in Chattanooga. No one knew who deposited the money or why. The burned land remained untouched, no one showing interest in rebuilding or reclaiming that space, which now carried a dark weight of mystery and tragedy. It was as if the place had been marked by something people preferred not to confront, a silent reminder of questions that remained unanswered. Years passed over the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee, like dense fog slowly dissipating under the morning sun. But the case of Mary Lou Carter never truly faded from the collective consciousness of that region. In 1915, as the world began to feel the distant tremors of conflicts that would soon engulf entire nations, a new generation of investigators decided to revisit the dusty archives of Sevier County. Among them was a man named Theodore Blackwell, a private investigator hired by a group of landowners concerned about the growing wave of suspicious transactions that continued to occur in the mountains. Blackwell was different from the local investigators who had worked on the case previously. Coming from Atlanta, he brought with him more modern investigative methods, an analytical mind trained in complex fraud cases, and a persistence bordering on obsession. He spent months immersed in the documents, reconstructing every move, every transaction, every testimony that had been collected since Mary Lou's disappearance. What he discovered was a far more elaborate web than anyone had imagined, connecting not just a few isolated individuals, but an entire network of operations that stretched across several mountainous counties. Blackwell's notes revealed meticulous patterns. He had mapped all the properties that had changed hands questionably between 1908 and 1914, marking them on a large map of the region that he kept spread out on his room's desk at the boarding house. There were 17 properties in all, each located in remote areas, each possessing characteristics that made them valuable in ways not immediately obvious. Some were near important waterways, others had access to mountain passes that would facilitate future road construction. Several were situated on land rumored to contain unexploited mineral deposits. The investigator uncovered something that had escaped local authorities. All the final buyers of these properties, though appearing in the documents under different names, were connected to a single Cincinnati-based development company. The company, called Appalachian Resources Corporation, had been established in 1907 and maintained discrete operations, rarely appearing in public records. Its directors were northern businessmen, respectable figures on the surface, but whose land acquisition methods did not withstand closer scrutiny. Blackwell suspected that William Thorne, and possibly even Samuel Hartwick, were merely pawns in a much larger operation, local facilitators of a scheme aimed at consolidating vast tracts of mountainous land for future exploitation. During his investigations, Blackwell received an unexpected visitor at his lodgings. It was the youngest son of a farmer who lived near Mary Lou's old property, a young man of about 20 who seemed to carry a heavy burden on his shoulders. The young man hesitated for a long time before speaking, glancing nervously at the door as if afraid of being seen. Finally, he revealed that his father, who had died 2 years earlier, had confessed on his deathbed to having witnessed something on the night Mary Lou disappeared. The old man was illegally hunting on the nearby lands when he saw a group of men around Mary Lou's property, carrying torches, their voices raised in heated discussion. The boy's father had remained hidden, fearing discovery during his illegal night hunt, and watched from afar as the men seemingly searched the area. He couldn't clearly see what they were doing due to the distance and darkness, but he heard fragments of conversation carried by the wind. Words like documents, signature, refusal. Mary Lou was present, of that he was certain, for he recognized her voice, firm but with a note of defiance he had never heard before. Then there was silence, followed by rapid movement, people dispersing in different directions. When everything was quiet again, he waited for hours before daring to leave his hiding place and return home, vowing never to speak of what he had witnessed for fear of retaliation. Why hadn't the old man spoken before? The son explained that his father had debts with powerful people in the region, depended on occasional jobs from influential landowners, and couldn't risk making enemies. Furthermore, he wasn't sure what he had actually seen, whether his presence had been noticed or if he was in danger. Only at the end of his life, when death approached and the fear of earthly consequences diminished in the face of deeper concerns, did he feel the need to ease his conscience, passing the weight of that secret onto his son. Now the young man, finally gathering courage, had decided that the truth deserved to be known, even if belatedly. Blackwell meticulously recorded the testimony, acknowledging its limitations but also its value. It was circumstantial evidence, second-hand memory, impossible to fully verify. But it confirmed his suspicions that Mary Lou's disappearance had not been accidental, nor a voluntary decision to leave. Something had happened that night, something involving multiple people, requiring planning and coordination. The question remained, what exactly had occurred, and more importantly, where was Mary Lou Carter now? The investigator decided to visit Cincinnati, following the trail of the Appalachian Resources Corporation. The journey took days, crossing mountains and valleys, small towns and dusty roads, until finally arriving in the bustling city on the banks of the Ohio River. There he discovered that the company maintained modest offices in a commercial building, but its operations were surprisingly extensive. Through careful conversations with employees and analysis of available public records, Blackwell confirmed that the corporation had acquired hundreds of acres in the Tennessee mountains and adjacent regions over the past few years, always through intermediaries, always avoiding direct transactions. One of the company's directors, when he finally agreed to meet with Blackwell, denied any wrongdoing. He claimed the corporation operated within the law, buying land from willing sellers through authorized agents. If some of these agents had used questionable methods, that was their responsibility, not the company's. As for the whereabouts of people like Mary Lou Carter, or the fate of other landowners who disappeared after selling their land, the director simply threw up his hands in a gesture of ignorance. It wasn't the corporation's responsibility to track down every person who decided to sell their property and change their lives, he argued with a cold logic that Blackwell found difficult to legally challenge, though morally repugnant. Back in Tennessee, Blackwell compiled all his findings into a detailed report, which he submitted to county authorities. The document was impressive in its scope, connecting dots that had remained isolated for years, revealing the magnitude of what was likely a systematic land acquisition scheme using methods that, if not technically illegal, certainly navigated morally murky waters. But there was a fundamental problem with all that meticulous work. Without a body, without physical evidence of a crime, without direct witnesses willing to testify under oath, the case remained in legal limbo, a collection of well-founded suspicions that could not be transformed into formal charges. Blackwell's frustration was palpable in his personal letters, some of which have been preserved in historical archives. He wrote about the injustice of knowing the truth but not being able to prove it, about people who had likely been coerced or, worse, whose fate remained unknown while those responsible went on with their lives without consequences. The investigator spent another year trying to find that final piece of evidence that would turn suspicion into certainty, but it never materialized. Eventually, his funds ran out, his clients lost hope, and Theodore Blackwell left Tennessee, leaving behind a case that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The 1920s brought significant transformations to the Appalachian Mountains. Better roads began to be built, connecting communities that had previously remained isolated for months during the harsh winters. Electricity reached the larger villages, bringing with it a sense of modernity that contrasted with the ancient secrets still buried in those mountains. Mary Lou's property, or what remained of it after the fire, remained abandoned, but the surrounding land began to show signs of renewed activity. The Appalachian Resources Corporation finally began visible operations in the region, bringing workers and equipment to exploit resources they had silently coveted for so long. In 1923, during preparatory excavations for a new road that would cut through the mountains, workers made a discovery that rekindled interest in the case of Mary Lou Carter. A few kilometers from her former property, in a densely wooded area that was rarely traversed, they found the remains of an old wagon, partially buried under layers of decaying leaves and vegetation. The wagon was in a terrible state of disrepair, the wood rotten and the metal corroded by time and moisture. But there was something about it that caught the workers' attention. Personal belongings were scattered around, protected from complete deterioration by having fallen into a depression in the ground that kept them relatively dry. Among the objects found was a silver medallion, blackened by oxidation but still identifiable. When carefully cleaned, it revealed initials engraved on the back. Local authorities, consulting old records, confirmed that the initials matched those of Mary Lou Carter. There were also fragments of fabric that may have been part of clothing, some household utensils, and, most intriguingly, a small wooden chest that had miraculously withstood the elements. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture, were more pages from Mary Lou's diary, entries that had never been found in the house before. These additional diary pages offered a disturbing window into the final days before Mary Lou's disappearance. Her handwriting, normally firm and controlled, showed signs of growing agitation. She wrote of constant pressure, men appearing on her property with increasingly insistent offers to buy her land. She mentioned veiled threats, suggestions that it would be safer for her to accept and leave while she could still do so on her own terms. Mary Lou recorded her determined refusal, her decision not to be intimidated, but also her growing fear that the situation was spiraling out of control. One particularly revealing entry, dated just 3 days before her disappearance, mentioned a meeting she had been forced to accept. Representatives of a group interested in her land were coming to the property for a final discussion. Mary Lou wrote that she had taken precautions, hidden important documents in safe places, and made copies of property records proving her indisputable ownership. She expressed hope that, confronted with solid evidence of her legal rights, the interested parties would finally leave her alone. But there was also a note of resignation, an acknowledgement that people with sufficient resources and determination were rarely deterred by mere legal documents. The discovery of the wagon and those belongings generated renewed speculation about what might have happened. Had Mary Lou tried to flee, taking her most valuable possessions, only to be intercepted in that isolated area? The wagon's location suggested she was following an old trail leading out of the county, a little used route that would offer discretion. Or had someone deliberately left those objects there, creating the appearance of an escape that never actually occurred? The possibilities were many, each painting a different picture of the events of that dark night. A surprising development occurred when a retired carpenter, now elderly, approached the authorities with a confession that had weighed on his conscience for years. He admitted to having been hired in 1912 by men he didn't know to build a secret compartment in a structure located on a remote property. The work had been well paid, on the condition that he maintain absolute silence about its nature and location. At the time, desperately needing the money to support his family, he had accepted without question. Now, nearing the end of his life and seeking spiritual peace, he felt the need to reveal what he knew. According to the carpenter, the secret compartment had been built in a barn on the Brennan property, the same family that had long-standing disputes with Mary Lou over land boundaries. The space was designed to be imperceptible, accessible only through a hidden mechanism, large enough to store documents or other valuables. The man didn't know the compartment's specific purpose, but the insistence on secrecy and the urgency with which the work needed to be completed had always made him uneasy. He provided detailed descriptions of the hiding place's location and construction. Authorities obtained permission to examine the Brennan property, which was now managed by the next generation of the family. The current members seemed genuinely surprised by the carpenter's claim, stating they were unaware of any secret compartment on their premises. When investigators finally located and opened the hiding place following the instructions provided, they found exactly what the carpenter had described, but the compartment was empty, except for some old cobwebs and a thin layer of dust. If anything had been stored there, it had been removed long ago, leaving no clues as to its nature or fate. The Brennan family cooperated fully with the investigation, allowing complete access to the property and answering all questions. The oldest surviving members of the family admitted that yes, there had been tensions with Mary Lou over land, but insisted that everything had always been kept within the legal framework, through courts and proper documentation. They denied any knowledge of the secret compartment or any involvement in her disappearance. Their sincerity was difficult to assess. Faces shaped by years of hard living in the mountains rarely revealed emotions easily. But without concrete evidence connecting them to any crime, the authorities could do no more than record their statements and keep the case open. The 1930s arrived, bringing with them the Great Depression, and even the isolated mountains of Tennessee felt the weight of the economic hardships sweeping the country. Properties that once held some value became nearly impossible to sell, and ironically, the land acquisition schemes that had marked the previous decade virtually ceased. The Appalachian Resources Corporation drastically reduced its operations, maintaining only a minimal presence in the region. It was during this period of scarcity and hardship that people began to speak more openly about the past, perhaps because they had less to lose or because the privations of the present made old secrets less important. A series of articles published in a regional newspaper in 1934 rekindled public interest in the case of Mary Lou Carter. The journalist responsible, a young man named Marcus Webb, had grown up hearing stories about the disappearance and decided to investigate on his own. He traveled the region interviewing elderly people who still remembered those days, collecting fragments of memories that individually seemed insignificant, but which together began to form a more complete narrative. Webb had a special talent for making people feel comfortable, and many shared details with him that they had never officially mentioned. A woman who had worked as a laundress for several families in the region revealed something she had never thought relevant. Weeks after Mary Lou's disappearance, she was called to wash clothes on the property of a prominent family in the county. Among the items, she found a men's shirt with stains that caught her attention, not because they were blood, but because they were red earth mixed with something oily, a type of dirt she recognized from specific areas in the mountains where the soil had particular characteristics. The shirt also had tears that suggested forced passage through dense vegetation. When she asked how to properly wash the garment, she was instructed to simply discard it, burning it along with other old rags. Another testimony came from a man who had worked as a blacksmith in the village during those years. He remembered being approached by a client who needed urgent repairs to digging tools, shovels, and pickaxes that were unusually damaged, as if they had been used with excessive force on rocky ground. The client had paid well and asked for discretion, something that at the time hadn't seemed particularly suspicious, but which now, recalling it in the context of Mary Lou's disappearance, took on a different weight. The blacksmith couldn't remember exactly who the client was, so many years had passed, but he remembered that it was someone from outside the village, not a regular local resident. Marcus Webb compiled dozens of such small accounts, each adding a brushstroke to the larger picture. He discovered that in the week following Mary Lou's disappearance, there had been an unusual movement of people temporarily leaving the region. Workers who normally remained employed on local properties suddenly departed, citing opportunities in other counties. Some of them never returned, settling permanently in distant places. Was it a coincidence, or did these people know something that made them want to distance themselves from that place and those events? The journalist also investigated the records of the Appalachian Resources Corporation more deeply, discovering that shortly after the period of the disappearances, the company had undergone a significant restructuring. Several of its original directors had retired, selling their stakes and severing ties with the organization. One of them, a Cincinnati businessman named Harold Pemberton, had abruptly moved to the West Coast, where he lived in relative isolation until his death in 1928. Among his personal papers, discovered after his death, was a diary that mentioned deep regrets about business decisions made in Tennessee, although it never specified exactly which decisions or why he carried such weight. In one of his most revealing interviews, Webb spoke with a retired pastor who had served several mountain communities during those years. The clergyman, now quite elderly and frail, shared that several people had sought spiritual counseling in the months following Mary Lou's disappearance, people who seemed to be struggling with deep guilt over something they couldn't fully articulate. He had respected the confidentiality of these conversations for decades, but now, near the end of his own life, he felt he could at least confirm that several souls had been tormented by events related to that dark period, without violating the specific details that had been confided to him. Webb's articles caused a sensation in the region, generating heated debates about what had really happened to Mary Lou Carter. Some accused the journalist of unnecessarily reviving old tragedies, of reopening wounds that should remain closed. Others praised him for keeping alive the memory of an unresolved injustice, for refusing to let time completely erase the search for truth. The authorities, pressured by renewed public interest, officially reopened the case, albeit with limited resources, due to the economic difficulties of the time. During this new phase of the investigation, a detail forgotten in the files caught their attention. In the days following Mary Lou's disappearance, there was a record of an unusual sale at a hardware store in the neighboring county. Someone had purchased a substantial quantity of quicklime, a product used for various agricultural purposes, but also known for its properties of accelerating decomposition. The purchase was made by a man who paid in cash and left no name, something that was not uncommon in smaller transactions at the time, but which now seemed potentially significant. The merchant who made the sale had already passed away, making any further clarification impossible. World War II brought profound changes to the entire country, and the Appalachian Mountains were no exception. Many young men left to serve in the armed forces, and when they returned, they brought different perspectives on the world and on their own communities. The region began to modernize more rapidly, with new roads cutting through the mountains, facilitating access to areas that had previously remained largely untouched. It was during this period of transformation, in 1947, that a war veteran named James Holloway decided to settle near Mary Lou Carter's former property, purchasing land that had remained unused since a fire decades earlier. Holloway was a practical man, not given to superstitions, but even he admitted to feeling something strange about those lands. During the clearing work to build his new house, he and his workers found objects buried in various parts of the property. They were common things: old tools, fragments of pottery, pieces of metal corroded by time. But the distribution of these finds seemed deliberate, as if someone had systematically hidden items throughout the area. Holloway kept the most interesting objects, creating a small collection that he kept in his barn, thinking that perhaps one day they might reveal something about the history of that place. One stormy night in 1949, lightning struck an old tree on the edge of Holloway's property, knocking it down and exposing its deep roots. When the storm passed and he went out to assess the damage, he noticed something unusual among the exposed roots. There were stones arranged unnaturally, as if someone had built a small underground structure that the tree had eventually enveloped with its roots over the years. With the help of neighbors, Holloway carefully excavated the area, revealing what appeared to be a deliberately created hiding place, a small space lined with stones, where something might have been kept protected from the elements. Inside this hiding place, wrapped in oiled canvas that had miraculously resisted partial decomposition, was a thick envelope containing documents. The ink had faded in many places, making some sections illegible, but enough remained intact to reveal extraordinary information. They were contracts, land purchase and sale agreements, all involving properties in the region, all dating from the period between 1908 and 1912. Most striking was that many of these documents contained obvious irregularities, signatures that appeared forged, witnesses who probably never existed, clauses that benefited buyers in ways that few sellers would willingly accept. Among the papers was a letter, written by Mary Lou Carter herself, dated a few days before her disappearance. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, but it seemed to be a kind of testimony, a record for posterity. In it, Mary Lou described systematic pressures she had been suffering, not only on herself, but on other property owners in the area. She mentioned names, some that had already appeared in previous investigations, others that were new. She explained that she had begun documenting everything, collecting evidence of fraudulent practices, planning to eventually take everything to the authorities in Knoxville, or perhaps even to federal authorities. The letter revealed that Mary Lou had discovered a disturbing pattern. Landowners who refused initial purchase offers began to face inexplicable difficulties. Animals disappeared or were found injured. Tools were stolen. Small fires broke out in barns or fields. Nothing that could be definitively linked to those interested in buying the land, but enough to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. When these intimidation tactics failed, the methods became more direct, with veiled threats to personal safety and insinuations about accidents that could happen in such isolated and dangerous regions. Mary Lou wrote that she had hidden copies of all the incriminating documents in different places, ensuring that even if something happened to her, the truth would eventually come to light. This particular hiding place was just one of several she had created, a precaution against those who tried to silence her. The letter ended on a somber note, expressing hope that if anyone was reading it, it would mean her strategy had worked and that justice could finally be served, even if belatedly. Reading those words, written by a woman who knew she was in danger but refused to give in, was deeply moving and disturbing. Holloway immediately took the documents to the authorities, who were simultaneously fascinated and frustrated by the discovery. Fascinated because they finally had concrete evidence of widespread fraudulent practices, frustrated because most of the people mentioned in the documents had long since died or disappeared. The Appalachian Resources Corporation still existed, but under new management that had no connection to the original operations. Prosecuting crimes that occurred decades ago, with dead witnesses and fragmented evidence, presented enormous legal challenges. Even so, the discovery brought a certain closure to many families who had lost property under questionable circumstances. The documents proved their suspicions were correct, that they had been victims of a coordinated scheme and not simply unlucky in legitimate business dealings. Some descendants were able to use the evidence to challenge old transactions, recovering land their families had lost decades earlier. It wasn't complete justice, but it was something, a recognition that injustices had occurred and that the victims deserved validation, even if it came too late for many. As for Mary Lou Carter, her letter hidden among the roots of that ancient tree was the closest anyone came to hearing her voice again. She had fought against forces far greater than any one person could reasonably face. She had tried to protect not only her own land, but to document crimes that affected an entire region. Her ultimate fate remained unknown, but her courage and determination were forever recorded on those pages preserved by the land she had fought so hard to keep. The following decades brought slow but inevitable transformations to that region of the Appalachian Mountains. The world around them was changing rapidly, but the mountains remained silent witnesses to ancient secrets that continued to be buried in their slopes. In 1973, when the area began to attract occasional visitors interested in dark stories from the past, something unexpected happened that rekindled conversations about Mary Lou Carter and the events of that distant autumn of 1912. A landowner who had purchased a plot of land near Mary Lou's former property decided to make improvements to his land. During excavations to build a new barn, his workers found something buried deep in the ground. It was a rusty metal box, the kind used decades ago to store important documents. When they managed to open it, they discovered that there were still papers inside, protected from moisture by the metal that encased them. The documents were fragile, stained by time, but still largely legible. The content was disturbing. There were handwritten notes, lists of names and dates, records that seemed to document meetings and transactions that were never officially acknowledged. Some entries mentioned late-night meetings, discussions about specific properties, references to people who needed to be convinced or persuaded. The language was cautious, using vague terms that could have multiple meanings, but the overall context suggested activities that deliberately avoided public scrutiny. There were no clear signatures, only initials that could not be definitively attributed to specific individuals. Among the papers was also a hand-drawn map showing the region with special markings at various points. Some of these locations corresponded to properties that had changed hands during those turbulent years. Other markings indicated places in the mountains that had no known buildings, isolated areas difficult to access where something could be hidden without fear of accidental discovery. The map seemed to be a guide for someone who needed to navigate that territory for purposes that were not entirely innocent. The owner who made the discovery hesitated before taking the documents to the authorities. Part of him questioned whether digging up the past would bring any real benefit or would only cause renewed pain in a community that had learned to live with unsolved mysteries. But eventually, feeling that the truth deserved to be known even if incomplete, he shared the find with the county office. The reaction was mixed, some expressing gratitude for the new evidence, others wishing that certain things would remain buried where time had placed them. During the years that followed, scholars occasionally visited the region, interested in understanding not only the specific case of Mary Lou Carter, but the broader context of how isolated communities dealt with internal conflicts and external pressures. These visitors spoke with older residents, collecting stories that had been passed down through generations. Many of these narratives were fragmented, details lost or distorted with each retransmission, but patterns emerged. They spoke of a time when the law was distant, and people needed to solve problems on their own, not always through methods that would withstand moral judgment later. There were also stories about places in the mountains that people avoided, not because of obvious physical danger, but because of a feeling of unease they couldn't rationally explain. Certain valleys where the fog seemed denser, certain trails that even experienced hunters preferred not to tread. These superstitions were perhaps just manifestations of collective fears, or perhaps they represented some ancestral memory of events that had truly marked those places in ways that transcended simple explanation. One particularly interesting aspect that emerged from these conversations was how different families in the region remembered the period in contradictory ways. For some, those years represented times of opportunity when land could be acquired by those willing to work hard. For others, they were dark times when injustices occurred under a cloak of dubious legality. These divergent perspectives reflected not only differences in experience, but possibly also different levels of involvement or knowledge about what had actually happened in those mountains decades ago. Over the years, Mary Lou Carter became an almost mythical figure in the region. Some remembered her as a stubborn woman who could have avoided her fate if she had been more flexible. Others saw her as someone who stood up for principles when it would have been easier to yield, someone whose courage deserved to be honored, even if her ultimate sacrifice was never fully understood. The truth about who she really was probably lay somewhere between these extremes, a complex person facing impossible circumstances and making choices that seemed right at the time. The property where she had lived continued to exist only as a memory and some stone foundations partially covered by vegetation. Nature had reclaimed that space, trees growing where human structures had once stood, wild animals making dens where domestic life had once existed. In a sense, the mountains had swallowed that chapter of human history, absorbing it back into themselves as they eventually did with everything else. But the memory persisted, transmitted through stories, documents in dusty archives, and in the collective consciousness of a community that never completely forgot. The years passed like leaves carried by the wind through the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, each season bringing its own transformations, but always leaving something unchanged in the heart of those ancient mountains. The new millennium arrived, bringing with it technologies that would have seemed magical to the inhabitants of that region in 1912. But even with all the modernity, certain questions remained suspended in the air like the mist that still covered the slopes at dawn. The story of Mary Lou Carter continued to live on, not in the official records that had become yellowed and fragile with time, but in the way people told and retold her narrative, each generation adding their own interpretations and reflections. In the early decades of the 21st century, the once isolated region was now connected to the rest of the world in ways its original inhabitants could never have imagined. Paved roads cut through the mountains where only narrow trails had once existed. Tourists visited the preserved natural areas, walking through forests without ever knowing the dark stories those ancient trees might tell if they could speak. The property where Mary Lou had lived remained in private hands, passed down through generations of owners who knew the history of the place but chose to live there nonetheless, perhaps finding a certain dark romanticism in that connection to the past. Occasionally, someone new would arrive in the region and hear the stories for the first time. Their reaction was always similar, a mixture of fascination and unease at realizing that genuine mysteries still existed, that not everything in life had clear explanations or definitive endings. These people usually asked the same questions that had already been asked thousands of times before. What really happened to Mary Lou Carter? Did she simply leave to start a new life somewhere far away? Or did something more sinister occur in those mountains that autumn of 1912? Why did so many other properties change hands under similar circumstances? Who really benefited from all those disappearances and suspicious transactions? The answers, when they came, were always unsatisfactory because they were incomplete. There were fragments of truth scattered throughout decades of investigations, testimonies, accidental discoveries, and deathbed confessions. But these fragments never fully came together to form a clear and definitive picture. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces had been lost and the rest were too faded to clearly show their original colors. Each person who studied the case arrived at slightly different conclusions, based on which evidence they chose to emphasize and which testimonies they considered most reliable. What could be said with certainty, based on all the surviving documentation and all the testimonies collected over the years, was that Mary Lou Carter had been a woman who refused to be intimidated. At a time when women often had limited options and a diminished voice in matters of property and business, she stood her ground against forces that would have crushed less determined people. She had recognized a pattern of injustice, attempted to document it, and tried to protect not only her own interests but possibly those of others who were being similarly pressured. This courage, regardless of the final outcome, deserved to be remembered and honored. The mountain region also bore its own invisible scars from that period. Families who had lost their lands through questionable means never fully recovered. Subsequent generations growing up with stories of past injustices that could not be righted. Other families who had prospered during those years always lived under a shadow of suspicion, silent questions about whether their prosperity had been built on morally dubious foundations. These ancient tensions still subtly echoed in the relationships between descendants, an invisible but palpable legacy of events that occurred long before any living person was born. As time passed, the exact nature of the events of that crucial night in 1912 became impossible to determine with absolute certainty. All those directly involved had long since passed away, taking with them any definitive knowledge they possessed. The surviving documents were suggestive but not conclusive, pointing in directions without providing final destinations. Partial confessions and fragmented testimonies created an atmosphere of incomplete knowledge, where much was hinted at but little was definitively proven. It was a frustrating situation for those who desired clarity, but perhaps appropriate for a case so deeply rooted in shadows and secrecy. There was also a broader philosophical dimension to the case of Mary Lou Carter that transcended the specific details of her disappearance. Her story represented something universal about the fragility of justice in places where power and isolation combined, where people with resources could operate outside of public scrutiny, where victims had few mechanisms for protection or recourse. It was not unique to that region or that time. Similar patterns could be found throughout history, in different places and contexts. Mary Lou's particular case was merely a specific manifestation of broader dynamics that remained relevant even in modern times. For those who lived in the region, the story had become part of the local cultural identity, a shared narrative that everyone knew to some extent. It was told around campfires during camping trips, discussed at community gatherings, and mentioned in casual conversations whenever the topic of local history came up. Each person had their own favorite version, emphasizing different aspects depending on their own perspectives and values. Some focused on the unsolved mystery, others on social injustice, still others on individual courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. All these interpretations were valid because they all illuminated different facets of a complex story. The mountains themselves remained unchanged in their essence, even as superficial details shifted with each generation. The same peaks that Mary Lou had contemplated from her balcony still rose against the sky. The same rock formations still divided valleys and slopes. The same rivers still flowed through deep gorges, carrying water from the heights to the distant plains. There was something comforting in this permanence, a sense that regardless of the human dramas unfolding on their surface, the mountains would continue to exist, silent witnesses that would never fully reveal the secrets they held. Modern visitors who walked the trails in the area where Mary Lou lived sometimes reported strange sensations, an inexplicable melancholy that enveloped them in certain places, a sense of presence that they could not rationalize but also could not completely deny. Skeptics would say it was simply the power of suggestion, prior knowledge of the story, creating expectations that the mind then filled with emotional interpretations of normal environmental stimuli. But those who experienced these sensations generally insisted that there was something more, something genuine in that charged atmosphere that certain places possessed. The question of justice in the Mary Lou Carter case was particularly complex, because even when evidence of wrongdoing was discovered, time made it impossible to apply meaningful consequences. Those responsible had already died, companies had been dissolved or transformed beyond recognition, property had changed hands multiple times, making ownership issues nearly impossible to resolve retroactively. There was a deep frustration in this reality, a recognition that some injustices simply could not be righted, no matter how much one wished to. All that remained was acknowledgement, memory, and perhaps some form of validation for those who had suffered, for even if it came too late to make a practical difference. Looking back through the distorted mirror of time, the autumn of 1912 in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee represented a moment where individual choices and social forces collided in ways that left permanent marks. Mary Lou Carter had made her choices based on principles she valued, refusing to yield even when it would have been safer and easier to do so. Others around her also made choices, some out of greed, some out of fear, some out of conflicting loyalties, that made right decisions impossible to clearly identify. None of these people could have fully foreseen the long-term consequences of their actions, as their moments of decision in 1912 would continue to echo through future generations. History teaches us that truth is often more complex than we would like, that definitive endings are rarer than fictional narratives lead us to expect, that justice is often imperfect and incomplete. The case of Mary Lou Carter exemplified all these uncomfortable realities. It was a story without a satisfying conclusion, without a clearly identified villain being punished, without a heroine being vindicated in a way that would restore everything that had been lost. It was messy, ambiguous, frustratingly incomplete, and perhaps precisely for that reason, it was an important story to remember, because it accurately reflected how the world often works outside the neat structures we prefer to imagine. Today, when we look at those mountains that have witnessed so many secrets, we can only speculate about all that remains hidden beneath their surfaces. How many other similar stories have never been told? How many other mysteries have never been investigated? How many other injustices have never been acknowledged? Mary Lou Carter had the distinction of having her story preserved, even if incompletely. But surely there were many others whose names have been completely lost, whose sufferings left no trace in official records or collective memory. Thinking about them, those absent from history, adds another layer of melancholy to a narrative already laden with sadness. Mary Lou Carter's ultimate legacy may not be found in definitive answers about her fate, but in how her story makes us reflect on courage, justice, and the nature of truth. She reminds us that individuals can make a difference even when facing impossible odds, that documenting injustice has value, even when it doesn't immediately lead to correction, and that refusing to be silenced is a significant act of resistance regardless of the outcome. These are lessons that transcend the specific context of 1912 and remain relevant in any time or place where power attempts to suppress truth. And so, more than a century after that distant autumn, the Tennessee mountains continue to hold their secrets. The mist still rises from the valleys at dawn, the wind still whispers through the pines, and somewhere on those ancient slopes, perhaps answers still await discovery. Or perhaps some questions are destined to remain unanswered. Humble reminders that not everything can be known, not everything can be explained, and that mystery is an inherent part of the human experience that we must learn to accept with grace. If this journey through one of the darkest and most intriguing periods in mountain history has captured your attention, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories, exploring the forgotten and mysterious corners of the past. Each narrative we share here is an invitation to reflect not only on specific events, but on human nature, moral choices, and the complex ways in which truth and memory interact across time.